Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Papers podcast. My name is Lara Varpio, and today we are having our inaugural Methods Consult. So just like for those clinician educators in the audience, if you find yourself working in the clinic and need a little help, a little second opinion, you might call for a consult. That's precisely what these recordings are. Just a little consult, not for the clinic, but for your research methods, and maybe even your research theories that you're using and relying on. So today, in our inaugural edition, I'm going to cover what really is in many ways the absolute basics of any research you'll ever do. I'm going to use a phrase, and I don't want it to make anybody nervous, because today we're going to talk about philosophies of science and research paradigms. And the reason this is so important, the reason it's foundational, is that this is the groundwork for all of the decisions you'll make as you move forward in the research enterprise. Because your paradigm is really essentially, it's a worldview, it's a way of thinking about reality and about knowledge and about the work of research. And it shapes all of the things that you will do, from writing a research question all the way to all the decisions of rigor and generalizability, and those arguments you're going to try to make when the data is finished and analyzed and you're trying to get your work published. So it's really important to know what your assumptions are. What is your paradigm? So today we're going to go through some of this. I'm going to only cover two of the most commonly used paradigms in our field, and I'm going to have to do a lot of simplifications, as you can imagine. When it comes to anything like spaces in philosophy, the different topics I cover there's a lot of detail, a lot of debate. So what I'm going to give you here is one short snippet overview. So I guess the thing I'm saying is, if I do this well, I'm going to leave you wanting more. And so what you'll do at the end of this recording, I'll make sure to put up on our show notes some additional links to citations for articles that address the philosophies of science, and I'll make sure that they were written for the health professions education community. All right. So with all of that said, everybody brace yourself, because we're about to get into this. I want to start by asking you to imagine our field of health professions education, and just in your mind, visualize what that means to you. So the people, the physical spaces, the topics, the policies, the organizations we deal with. Think of the breadth and depth and diversity of what it is we do in HPE. How do we go about studying this? How do we go about thinking about this space of all these people and places and things? Well, what I'm going to do for starters is ask you to organize that picture onto two sides. So on the one side, let's put all of the people that you work with and the organizations that you work with. So learners, faculty members, policy organizations, all those sorts of things. And let's put on the other side some of the physical, hands-on things you need to do, be it learning suturing skills, or different technical skills for the clinic, the electronic health record, all the patient records, the walls of the hospital, the setup of the classroom. All right, so let's just pretend for now that we can artificially tease those two apart, so that we have on one side the social reality, and on the other side, we have the physical reality. So I'm going to take you over first. Let's examine that physical reality. How are we going to examine and study the things and topics that we see in this space? Well, one of the ways of doing that, and one of the ways that we see a lot, is actually the foundational premises of a lot of scientific research, and probably a lot for many of you listeners, is things like the scientific method. That scientific method was originally developed for this side of the world, for the physical reality. We want to come at it objectively. We don't want to influence that physical reality. We want to see how it works and try to develop cause and effect explanations. So in order to do that, we need to be rather controlled and do everything that we can to study one variable in that physical reality, and without changing the other ones. We're going to observe it. We're going to build knowledge through objective observations and measurements. And I need to do that in a space that lets me, for instance, replicate those findings. So we're looking for unchanging regularities, the things that happen consistently in that physical world. So for instance, one thing, if we take, for example, in that physical space, the need to learn to suture. Think of all the physical pieces of reality involved in that work. The different needles, the threads, the different kinds of skin that different patients can have, the different kinds of wounds, the deep versus surface, ones that might benefit from a suture or others that might need glue or staples. We can study that physical space. We can develop an understanding of cause and effect relationships between different things that we do. And we can measure the success of that. How well does this wound heal? We can do experiments to see, well, if I teach this to students to suture this way, how long does it take them to master this skill? There's a lot that we can do by studying the world objectively. Sure, makes sense, right? This is really probably very familiar to you. It's how drug companies do studies of pharmacology to see if this drug impacts disease Y, all those sorts of things. You're probably very familiar with this kind of way of thinking. All right, so let's go to the other side. Let's go over to that social reality side. Now, in the social reality, it's a little harder to be objective because people are interacting with each other in ways we can't control. And social reality is funny because cultures exist and groups exist and group dynamics exist where for some people, some actions are very permissible and for others, those same actions really aren't. And it's in those social spaces that a lot of health professions education also happens. Think about topics like professionalism, right? In that social space, professionalism is not the same for all of the people or groups or organizations or cultures that are part of our health professions education space. One of the ways that I tend to think about phenomenon that I'm studying in those social spaces to know if it really should belong over there, one of the questions I ask is, would this phenomenon be the same 50 years ago or 500 miles away? So if I'm studying professionalism, would I be able to say that this definition of professionalism, this phenomenon, this piece of it right here was exactly the same 50 years ago and 500 miles away in a different country? Probably not. It probably looked really different, which means that it's not consistent. It's not stable. So working with things on this social side of the house, now I've got to recognize that the tools I had for studying reality physically and objectively, physical reality phenomenons, looking at them on the social side, some of those same techniques aren't going to work very well. Because if there's a right answer for how to suture, there probably isn't one right answer for professionalism. If there's one reality for this wound, this kind of skin, these kinds of techniques, I can observe that and I can see regularly on the physical side and measure success. Am I going to be able to engage the same kind of controls and expect people and cultures to act the same? Will there be that cause and effect? Will it be consistent? Can I say that I can study this reality as unchanging? On the social side, probably not. We're going to need a different way of thinking about that social side of our research. Now, remember, we're teasing these apart artificially. Because, as we know in health professions education, all of these pieces mix together, the physical and the social. They're all intertwined and engaging and influencing each other. But why I divide them for our conversation today to help us start to think about this so that we start to understand that actually when we're thinking about research, we need to be very clear about what kind of reality I'm studying. Am I studying a reality that is external to me, that is consistent, that I can observe through cause and effect and look for cause and effect relationships? Is it a reality that is permanent? That's one way of thinking. I'm going to call that today post-positivist side. It's more complicated, but that's some of the basic principles behind that way of thinking, that paradigm, post-positivism. All right, so if that's one way of thinking about it, some of the other things I'm going to study won't fit that way of thinking about reality. Instead, I'm going to need to think about reality as shifting as existing within people. So my perception of professionalism is not the same as yours, but they're both real. They're both within us. So reality is built. It's within me. It's within that other person. So there's multiple realities. They're not stable. They're evolving. And so on that side of the house, we're going to today call that constructivist. That's a different way of thinking about reality. All right. So now we have reality. The question now becomes, what am I going to do with this? Fine. Well, let's go back to that physical side of reality, because that's where many of you are more familiar. What happens when on that physical side, when I think that there's a single reality and I'm going to study it, how do we do that? What does good knowledge look like? Well, good knowledge is knowledge that is unbiased. We don't want the observer impacting that reality, because the object of study is the reality in its unchanging, it's consistent. So really, the best thing I should do is get out of the way. I need to be objective. I often use the example of the duck blind. I want to create the perfect hiding spot where I can see as a researcher the phenomenon I'm studying without impacting it. So I'm trying to build that perfect blind, that perfect duck hunting blind, so that the object I'm studying, the ducks, they don't know I'm doing it, which is wonderful, right? So we're going to be objective. We're going to aim for generalizability. We're going to worry about reliability. We're going to talk about ensuring validity arguments. We're going to do all kinds of things on this side of the house. All of this should sound extremely familiar, right? This is the land of basic science. This is the land of bench research. Many of you spent many an hour thinking in this way and being taught the scientific method. Perfect. That's what good science looks like. But when we go over to the constructivist side, when we're studying those social realities, well, to study those social realities, I can't just observe them. I need to ask questions of these people. I need to find out how they think, and I need to find out how they relate to each other. And to do that, I'm going to have to ask them some questions. And they're going to say something, and I'm going to think, well, that's important. So I'm going to have to draw more out. Now, all of a sudden, I'm not objective at all, am I? In order to study this, I have to recognize that the reality I'm building, this understanding I'm constructing, well, I'm part of it. I ask those questions. I encourage this way of thinking. I said that this piece over here looks really interesting. You emphasize that. Let's talk about that together. So in the constructivist space, objectivity doesn't hold. The word bias isn't bad, because quite honestly, bias is the whole point. I need to understand this person's perspective, their bias. I can't treat it as an object. It's their way of thinking. And this other person that they work with and they engage with, these other people, this culture, I need to understand their thinking. And to do that, I need to get in there. I need to understand what's going on. And that means I'm part of this research. So now the goal can't be objectivity, because I won't be able to get the kind of insights and generate appreciation for that kind of reality. I need different ways of thinking. So here, well, I need to describe my findings so that you can, as an audience, can describe, is this transferable to me? I probably am going to rely heavily on theory for other transferability arguments, because I can say, listen, this is what I learned from my engagement in this context. And I can abstract it into these kinds of statements, of premises that describe a phenomenon. And then I can share that with you and say, does this description and definition, does that resonate for you and your audience? So in that constructivist orientation, very different markers of rigor are at play. And what's really important here is that what I don't want anybody to walk away with is to think that some of these approaches are better or worse than others, because they're not better or worse. They're just different. They're different paradigms. I didn't give you a definition yet, but I've waited to now in hopes that this starts to make sense, because if I tell you the definition now, I want you to think about those two different realities, those two different ways of seeing our fields, two different ways of thinking about the reality of it and what good knowledge looks like. And so what is a paradigm? A paradigm is a worldview. A paradigm consists of shared beliefs about what reality is and what knowledge is and how I build knowledge. A paradigm shapes all of the things and decisions of how I do science. Now, again, I need to remind you that in our thought experiment today, I've teased them apart. I pulled the social and the physical apart. But in health professions education, in real life context, they aren't separated. They coexist. So we have theories, for instance, of social materiality that look at how the physical world impacts on social engagements and social interactions. So we recognize that the physical world isn't separate from the social. And when we study physical environments and physical objects, we often need to say, but in this context, it looks like this. Another paradigm that's really powerful is the realist paradigm. And they take context really seriously and look for, one of the best pieces of examples I can give you of realist research is a realist literature review that talks about what intervention works for whom in what contexts. They map it out in fascinating ways. They recognize that there are regularities, there are patterns. And so they study social engagements, but with this idea of cause and effect relationships still very much part of the way of thinking. So, dear listeners, the reason I want to make sure that this is relatively clear for you is that doing good science in health professions education can come from many different paradigms. And when they come from different paradigms, it means we hold different conceptualizations of what reality is and of what knowledge is. And what that means is that we hold different assessments or standards of rigor in each of those paradigms. So what's really important, and why on the Papers podcast I give out a bonus mark if you tell me your paradigmatic orientation, is because by telling me that, you tell me what standard of rigor you're aiming for. What is the goal? This is how I'm thinking. And then I can say, thank you for that, because now that I understand how you think, I know what rigor looks like, because rigor looks different in different paradigms. And so with that, dear scholars and friends in the Papers community, our Papers people, I promised you some citations. So please go ahead and look at the show notes. There's all kinds of references to descriptions of paradigms and a post-positivist and constructivist paradigm so that you can wrap your arms around it. Again, today I gave you the highest overview, right? We were a 10,000 foot view. There's a lot more detail and insights that you can glean from those articles. I also, dear listener, want to encourage you to write to me. Did I make it better? Or did I just muddy the waters for you? Did I contradict myself? Because we all know that happens. I wish it didn't, but it does. So does this not resonate, or is this not consistent with something you've heard on the Papers podcast before? Write to us. Tell us what you think. We're always happy to hear from you. And so with that, dear listeners, this is the end of our inaugural Methods Consult here at the Papers podcast. I hope I've tried to show you some of the methods in our research madness, try to lay some of that bare. But more than anything, I hope that this gives you a little bit of insight, a little tool, so that as you move forward in your HPE research, you're a little better equipped than you were just a few minutes ago. And so with that, dear listeners, thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to talking to you soon.
You've been listening to the Papers podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.